Irish people were the other, against whom the British could define themselves. They were viewed as lazy, barbaric, barely human. Ireland itself was run as a colony for the emerging class of British capitalists. While England was rapidly becoming the wealthiest country in the world, Ireland was kept incredibly poor. The population was almost entirely composed of peasants. A large majority of all houses were huts made of mud. And the land those peasants lived on was owned almost entirely by absentee English landlords who never visited Ireland and extracted exorbitant amounts in rent. Even the British government regarded these landlords with disdain, calling them, quote, the most oppressive species of tyrant that has ever lent assistance to the destruction of a country. So most Irish people were on a treadmill of extreme poverty. They were the most destitute people in all of Europe. In many districts, one government report found, their only food is the potato, their only beverage, water, a bed or a blanket is a rare luxury. And that part about the potato is especially important. Ireland has a lot of fertile soil and a topography that is ideal for grazing cattle. But when the British came in and colonized Ireland, they systematically took that land and used it to produce beef for the domestic English market. And so the economically poor Irish turned to the potato, a versatile crop that could be grown in large numbers on bad soil. And while the potato was adaptable, it was also really unreliable. There had been widespread potato failures pretty much every other year in the 19th century. And in the 1840s, a new potato disease, originally from North America, arrived in Europe. Huge potato crop failures sprung up in northern France, in Belgium, and in the Netherlands. But none of those places were as dependent on the potato as a source of food as was Ireland. So when the disease got to Ireland in the 1840s, the results were devastating. In 1845, about a third of the Irish crop was destroyed. By 1846, 75% of it was gone. Hunger spread rapidly with unprecedented severity. This period became known in Ireland as Ondrachia, the bad life. But as Amartya Sen observed, this wasn't just about a pure lack of food. In fact, during the entire period of the famine, Ireland was continuing to export food out of the country. Enough cows, sheep, pigs, and grain were being shipped out of Ireland that could feed the Irish population twice over. But the British government refused to do anything about it. Soon, the Irish began begging their British overlords for relief. And early on, the Conservative Party government, then the representatives of the old British aristocracy, had a fairly sympathetic response. They bought food from America and brought it to Ireland, distributing it to the poor. But in 1846, a different party, the Whigs, came to power in Britain. And the Whigs did not have the sort of aristocratic paternalism that the Conservatives had. They were advocates of a philosophy called laissez-faire, the idea that the free market, left alone, would solve virtually any problem. So the person they put in charge of famine relief in Ireland was a man named Charles Trevelyan. Trevelyan had been a colonial administrator in India, and he was a big believer in those Malthusian ideas about population. He didn't really want to stop the starvation. He thought it was, well, necessary. The famine, Trevelyan said, was, quote, an effective mechanism for reducing surplus population. He said, it was the judgment of God that sent the famine to teach the Irish a lesson. The real evil, he said, is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the Irish people. So Trevelyan's solution to the famine was to let it ride. The laissez-faire Whigs decided to change nothing. They refused to stop the movement of food to England and limited the amount of food they offered to the starving Irish people. The food that was being imported into Ireland was largely used not to feed the Irish, but to feed the cattle being slaughtered for British consumption. Even when they did offer some relief to the Irish peasants, they instituted moralistic tests, requiring that recipients live as indentured servants in a workhouse to improve their work ethic. The British even required that food only go to people who owned almost no land, forcing impoverished farmers to sell all the remaining land they had to their landlords, many of whom lived in Britain. And so, the famine only got worse. Diseases of hunger like typhus, dysentery, and cholera spread wildly, killing just as many people as the lack of food. Social structures broke down. Ordinary people turned en masse to begging, crime, prostitution. In Western Ireland, some resorted to cannibalism. The British, fearing a rebellion, sent army troops instead of food. As the news of the famine spread all over the world, shiploads of food finally began arriving. Americans from all strata generously sent money and food over the Atlantic, only to have their donations met with huge British cargo fees upon arrival. Even the Choctaw people donated to the famine relief funds, just a few years after they had experienced starvation themselves on the Trail of Tears. It was a beautiful example of international solidarity. But these donations weren't enough to stop the ruthless exploitation by British landlords. Even when enough food was being imported, it wasn't getting to the Irish people. Starvation and death continued. Impoverished Irish, with barely enough to eat, were evicted from their homes. One priest remembers the scene of a mass eviction. Several hundred human beings were driven from their homes in one day and sent adrift on the world to gratify the caprice of one who before God and man probably deserved less consideration than the last and the least of them. The horrid scenes I had then witnessed I must remember all my life long. The wailing of women, the screams, the terror, the consternation of children, the speechless agony of honest, industrious men, wrung tears of grief from all who saw them. By the time the famine began to end in the early 1850s, about 20% of the Irish population, 2 million human beings, had died of disease or hunger. Another 2 million had left for brighter shores. Today, Ireland's population is still lower than it was in the 1840s. But Ireland has never forgotten the famine and the generosity that some showed to them. During COVID, when the people of the Navajo Nation were hit hard, Ireland repaid their kindness shown to them during the famine by raising $2 million. And Ireland has never forgotten those who did not help them, the British government, and all those who valued profits over humanity. As the British historian A.J.P. Taylor would later write, the English governing class had the blood of 2 million Irish people on their hands. All Ireland was a Belsen.